We have our character, and the character can move around, and this is all fine if the character only ever moves on a plane. And will also be fine if we do not need anything more interesting than I've currently set up, but for what I want to do, we'll need to have various environments. We'll also want things which the character can interact with, both in terms of environment and in terms of other characters. So there'll be 4 main environmental items that we'll need to interact with first. The first of these will be the terrain itself. The main way of creating terrain will be to use a ground plane and to deform this using the height map. So this is one of the first things I need to consider. Are we going to use height maps? This is one of the things which we can technically actually skip on, but I do want height maps in my environment, so this will be one of the first things which I'll need to start working on for the environment. If it is a purely industrial world, we do not necessarily need height maps, but that kind of world can be very bland, and man-made environments are generally most interesting when placed in the context of an environment. Then there are 2 major elements which interact with the terrain which we'll need to interact with. The first of these will be rocks. The creation of rocks is very easy within Houdini, and there are mountains of ways to create rocks. So this is something which I will leave till later, although interaction with rocks can be a major issue, as they generally do not have consistent shapes. The question of whether we can traverse rocks or not is something I'll work on after I've decided other traversal problems, as rocks can provide deceptively complicated traversal. The other main environmental item will be plants, and the main interaction for these will come from trees. With shrubbery and smaller plants, our character will either pass straight through them, or the character will be entirely blocked. The big question with trees, however, is, can we climb them? The other interactive question is, can we cut them down? At this point in the character setup, trees are also not very important. For the moment, we'll treat them as solid objects, as I will need to get far deeper into the prototype before making any concrete decisions about interactivity. The next major environmental items will be man-made objects, specifically buildings. Building structures will vary a lot. We can go from barely larger than the player to extremely large complexes. In this case, both of these will apply for what I want to do. These will affect our environment. They also affect the interactions of the player. And here we have 2 main questions again. The first is, can we climb the buildings? And the second is, can we enter the buildings? The buildings are something which I will need to work on. So of these environmental items, we'll start with the landscapes and the buildings. So we'll need to consider some of the issues for these. First, I'll look at the landscapes. So the first problem we have is that our character currently moves along strict planes. So first and foremost, we'll need to have the ability to detect the ground. We'll then need to calculate the player movement based off the ground, so that we can calculate our movement in a way that is relative to the ground slope. We will also want our animation to compensate for this movement. So currently our feet will rest along the plane, and the feet will not match up with the ground. So if we have a large curve, the ground will pass through the feet, or the feet will float above the ground. What we'll need to do is dynamically raise or lower the foot, and we'll want to orient them based off the ground. This is theoretically not as complicated as it sounds, but the implementation of something like this is never straightforward. So for example, we'll have complications depending on whether the character is running or if the character is walking. For example, with a walk, generally the foot will land on the heel. This is a reasonably unique pattern, and humans are reasonably unique in the way that we walk. We actually have one of the most efficient walking patterns of any animal, and the human foot is actually one of the most unique parts of human anatomy. And most of this is to facilitate walking. Running, however, works slightly differently. Running is something which a lot of people get wrong, and it is often animated extremely poorly. This is not necessarily poor in terms of mood or feel of the running, but in terms of technical correctness of running. For running, especially when running quickly, or when you're sprinting, the foot should generally land on the ball of the foot and not on the heel. There will generally be a small bit of give in the knee, as the leg acts as a spring here. The foot should not land on the heel. This does happen when people are jogging, and this is technically not a good running pattern, as it does lead to foot and leg injuries. When running correctly, you shouldn't actually land on the heel, you should land on the ball of the foot. When running efficiently, the contact with the ground will generally line with the center of gravity, but I will not continue with the biomechanics of sprinting. The main point here is that if we want this to be accurate, we'll need a different system for calculating ground contact when running than we do when the character is walking. Essentially, when we run, we want any IK compensation which we create for the foot to be calculated based off the ball of the foot, and when we walk, we need the contact to be calculated off the heel of the foot. Another big thing that we need to decide is relevant to both the character and the AI. So first we'll discuss this from the point of view of an AI. If we've got our environment here, we'll generally construct an extra mesh based off this mesh. If we're working with any commercial engines, this will generally work in exactly the same way, and it works in the same way in Unity and Unreal, and this mesh will be referred to as our nav mesh. Generally, every entity that is using this nav mesh will be regarded as a point on the nav mesh, and other objects working on this nav mesh will generally use a collision volume about this point, and this collision volume will be a cylinder. This will prevent collision but does not actually affect the entity itself. The entity will always be considered as a single point. This point can travel to the end of the nav mesh, and there will usually be an offset between the edge of the nav mesh and the final edge of the mesh, and this width would be the radius of the cylinder. There are a lot of problems which you can have with nav meshes. Nav meshes will not work well if the characters are of significantly different size. If we have an NPC that is much larger than the basic NPCs, we may need to have dedicated nav meshes which are smaller to prevent larger characters from appearing to pass through walls. We also have issues when using animation to drive characters with nav meshes. In short, there are a whole bunch of things which we'll need to look at here, especially with regard to NPCs, but even more so than the NPCs, we need to question how this applies to the player. One of the fundamental bugs and exploits which you find in a lot of games happens when a player or a character can move beyond the nav mesh. This can happen as a bug when an NPC can pass beyond the nav mesh and then can become stuck. However, this can also apply as an exploit. For example, currently our player does not use a nav mesh, so our player can move beyond where the nav mesh exists. When the player moves outside the range of the nav mesh, any NPCs which are supposed to interact with the player will no longer be able to interact with him. An easy example of this is a game like Days Gone. There are areas where you can traverse where the NPCs will struggle to get to, but more importantly, you can traverse with a motorcycle, which give you traversal options that do not exist for the player itself or for any of the NPCs. This leads to a lot of ways to overcome the game's main challenge, which are the hordes. So for example, we'll have this rock, and our horde will be coming in from this direction. The player could not normally climb this rock, but using the motorcycle, the player will be able to do this. So the player can get to the top of the rock. However, the nav mesh and the physics here can prevent the NPCs from climbing this rock. Here's some example footage of this. This footage is courtesy of Borislav 24/7. I've sped up the footage, but if you want to see this kind of exploit, he has numerous examples of it on his channel, along with numerous speedruns and guides to the challenges in Days Gone. To some level, this kind of behavior is unavoidable, but it can lead to a trivialization of a major feature within the game. But we should take steps to mitigate it, and one of the things to consider is whether we should actually restrict the player itself to the nav mesh. This is just the start of interaction with movement on the ground. I haven't discussed things like slopes and how we'll deal with that, but I want to deal with more basic movement before we get to that in any case. And before we do anything that complex, we need to get NPCs moving with the ground system as well, so we can test our movement system not only with our player, but with characters that we do not control directly. The next thing that we'll need some basic decisions on will be buildings. I want to be able to build the initial buildings reasonably quickly. Because of this, I'm going to use a grid-based approach. Essentially, I'll create my buildings using various blocks, and this should give me the majority of necessary structures. The first thing that I want to be able to have doors in these buildings, and I want to have the character enter through these doors. So I want to be able to traverse these buildings. I want the buildings to be navigable by default. We can always block off parts to the buildings later, and we can convert buildings to facade-based buildings later. But if we do not test with buildings with interiors, that will lead to a situation which is hard to implement if we need to change our mind, where converting to facades is always going to be an easier option. The height of a door will be about 2 meters. from the door to the roof will usually be about 2.8 meters. This is technically not usually 3 meters, but I will start off with this rounded off at 3. These proportions will define my character's movement, and they'll define all the base structures within the game. So we'll want to base our movements off this distance, especially with regard to climbing and jumping. Then there's the question of whether we actually want to have a climbing system or whether we're going to have a jumping system. For example, in a game which is more of an action platformer, we could skip climbing entirely and we could focus on jumping instead. There can be advantages to this kind of approach, as it leads to a more fluid movement system than when we actually have to constantly climb every surface. Climbing tends to slow down movement. An example of this would be a game like Nier Automata, which doesn't really have a climbing mechanic, apart from for the occasional ladders. For the most part, you traverse buildings by jumping onto them. This leads to a quick traversal system, and it also handles transitions for camera angles pretty well, because it allows for an easy transition from 3D angles to 2D angles, which would feel far more awkward if you had a proper climbing system there. Nier Automata is of course not a particularly good platformer, but the platforming aspects of it do give it a more fluid movement. This is something which I really need to consider, because this will determine how we approach our jumping. The more strict the climbing system, the more we'll limit our jumps. So I'll need to decide whether my focus is going to be on climbing or jumping. This will of course also be linked with the art style of the game, as more cartoonish movement like large jumps does not often work well with very realistic characters, and going that route means that I should consider a more stylized approach. This is not something which I'm deciding on yet, but it is something to consider. That said, in either to calculate either climbing or jumping, we'll need to have a base building set, so we'll need to be able to prototype layouts with building tools, so we will need to have at least some basic tools created in order to work on these mechanics. So I'll be starting on tiles with a width of 2 meters, a door height of 2 meters, and a wall height of 3 meters, and all of these are going to be built on a grid. This is something which we can extend later, but I want this to be a reasonably flexible system and something which is easy to lay out, and this will need to be developed in parallel with the player's movement. So we'll focus on the floor and the buildings, as well as working on a basic AI system, and we'll worry about details like trees and rocks later. So that's what we need to start working on, and we'll start working on these buildings and terrains next.